Alright, hello everybody, and welcome back, one and all, to a new series. I am, as always, Hungry Werewolf, and before I get started, I must read you something else first. The Deathworlders is copyright Philip Richard Johnson, aka Hambone, Hambone 3110, and Hambone HFY. Some rights are reserved. The copyright holder reserves all commercial rights and ownership of this intellectual property. Permission is given for other parties to share, redistribute, and copy this work under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 international license. All song lyrics, movie titles, or other copyrighted materials and trademarks that are referenced in this work under fair use are the property of their respective owners. This work contains deliberate mentions of real persons, places, trademarks, which are made purely for reasons of verisimilitude under nominative fair use. These mentions have not been endorsed or sponsored by those persons or by the owners or governing bodies of those trademarks or places. Otherwise, the events and characters portrayed in this story are fictional, and any resemblance to actual persons or events is accidental. The author does not automatically share or endorse the opinions and behaviors of the characters. Alright, now that that is out of the way, and I will link all that stuff to y'all in the About section. New series, The Deathworlders. This comes under HFY, which is Humanity Fuck Yeah, which was suggested to me by a custodial father in Texas. He's got a pretty good nose for stuff that I actually like to read, so I decided I'd give it a little digging, found a couple of things which weren't great, weren't bad, but weren't great. And a little bit more digging led me to here. And this led me, of course, to Mr. Johnson, and I got his permission to read The Deathworlders for my channel. It's pretty interesting read, actually, and it kind of takes like the usual cultural influence of how humanity is usually the scrappy underdog, and kind of turns that around to how we're actually, for lack of a better phrase, big dick swinging. That all being said, as you know, I like to, before I actually kick that, what I'll say is, I really like, let me try again once my brain starts functioning. If you enjoy this, because I thoroughly do, I've actually read all the way to chapter 39, as you can see, it's pretty long. I'm actually technically almost at the current end, but like the All Guardsman Party, it's ongoing. But I would highly recommend for any of you who also enjoy this, who enjoy the reading, please donate to Mr. Johnson. I will put the link right here of his PayPal and the link to his Patreon page in the About section of this video as well. That all being said, as you know, I like to review things before I jump into them. So, as a whole, I have to say, Deathworlders is a pretty solid 8 out of 10. It's got good blends of action areas, of developmental areas, and some places romance areas. Those I'm not as big a fan of, and there's some parts where I'm just, I feel like they could have been toned out or cut down a little bit, that sort of thing. I'd remember at one part thinking like, oh man, we're back to these guys again. Can we just go back to these ones? But it's just what I like as compared to what other people would like. So it's just essentially a differing in views. So I say 8 out of 10, good story, very good characters. The fact Mr. Johnson is not afraid to kill his characters, that honestly is a big plus for me, because you have some writers, and I've been guilty of doing it with my own writings, where characters just have plot armor, and it's annoying. It gets unbelievable and unrealistic, and then all of a sudden the characters in this story that you find you've been getting really close to, and you really like their character arc, well, it ends very abruptly. Sometimes, usually with an explosion or a bullet to the brain or some other stuff that isn't nearly as pleasant. But I can appreciate that. That being all said, I'm trying to think if I have anything else I should do before I start the Deathworlders. As I said, absolutely phenomenal book. And yeah, I think that's about it. I'm hoping I don't run into any technical difficulties this time. This is like the third or fourth time I've tried to record this. Hopefully it works. I had something more to say about it, but since I don't, I'm just going to start. So, the Deathworlders. Chapter 0, The Kevin Jenkins Experience. So I'm going to sit here for a little bit and give a brief actual request. Like, you read this. It's just a brief overview of what inspired Mr. Johnson to essentially write his story, as I understand it. What I do have a thing where I've just want to say I've been writing a bit myself, and it's not coherent at times, and it's kind of boring, and it's blah blah blah. But I'd like to hear from all you folks what you would think if I sometimes did some of my own work on my channel. I mean, admittedly, I know that sounds weird. Hey, I'm asking if you guys want to hear my work, but most of the stories I've been doing are somebody else's, and I could really use some of the critiques and try to get better at mine. Now I remember what I want to talk about, looking at this real quick. So, my Let's Plays, while I do this, are going to be on hold, because, as you can see, it's kind of, it's fucking long. But, some of the chapters are rather short, and others, as you get longer and longer in, it gets to be quite a trek. So, like, these first few, I'm going to try to bust out in one video. The rest, like, I'll just have to do them in sticks, really. And that's, like, pretty much the main announcements I have, other than the fact Shoggy has stated on the All Guardsmen Party he hopes to have it out by Christmas. That's not pertaining so much to this, but it's a very popular thing on my channel, so figure I should mention it. So, let me know what you want. If you want to hear some of my work, you wanted to see me try to do some Let's Plays while doing this, I can try. Admittedly, my Let's Plays aren't all that popular, so probably not, but hey. And, well, sit back, relax, and enjoy the Deathworlders. Chapter 0.1, The Kevin Jenkins Experience. Next, I ordered. I did not at first bother to look up from the desktop in front of me, where the standard security systems were scanning the being in front of me for weapons or pathogens, parasites, and other such contraband. I only looked up when the machine flashed a message I'd never seen before. Error. Unknown species. It was small. Barely tall enough to see over the top of my customs desk, in fact. A quadriform biped, 4 limbs ending in 5 manipulating digits. Much of its body was covered in obviously synthetic fabric, with only the forepaws and head visible. Much of the head, the top around the ears, and down under and around the mouth and nose, was covered in short, coarse fur of a brownish hue, apart from where this had been shaved in front of the ear to accept a cybernetic of some description. My desk registered this as the creature's interspecies communication implant, and though it seemed like a shockingly crude example, it met my surprised stare with a level binocular gaze of a species evolved for predation and the hunt. Small but powerful and dense seeming, despite its lack of height, and strapped a pack to its torso that looked larger and heavier than I could have comfortably carried. Abductee 907-42-96-53-3, and introduced itself. Name, Kevin Jenkins. Fortunately, the crude cybernetics seemed to be functioning perfectly, and I had no difficulty in understanding the thing's speech or the subtle body language that spoke of a cocktail of bored resignation and weariness. I had never had to deal with an abductee before, though I had been trained and knew exactly what to do, I closed the booth, stood up, and gestured for the alien to follow me with my second right forelimb. "I won't need to interview you in private," I told him. He picked up a second bag and strolled, well, carrying more than I suspected I could physically lift after me. Whatever this thing was, it was from a high-gravity planet. "Yeah, I know the drill," he said. "Pretty sure I'll be leaving this station before long, too." "What would that be?" I asked politely as I ushered him into the private interview corral and activated the privacy field. The sounds of immigration control evaporated as a sudden fuzzy silence engulfed us. He dropped the bags, and they landed with a solid, dense noise that told me they were exactly as heavy as they looked. "It's only a matter of time before your colleagues in security prosecute me for vagrancy," he said. Why would they do that?" I asked to make conversation as I prepared the official forms. "Article 227, paragraph 16 of the Galactic Treaty of Laws," he said, stretching out and rolling its head. His endoskeleton issued a loud clicking noise, and he issued a sigh that my implant interpreted as pleasure. He laughed, a sound that served the exact same purpose as it did in mine, though this one was tinged with bitterness. Technically, as a member of a pre-interplanetary species, I am non-sentient specimen of indigenous fauna, and therefore cannot be legally employed or own property. I indicated my understanding by nodding, a gesture our body language shared in common, and raising the fur at the nape of my neck. "The Cordy abducted you, didn't they?" "My kind call them the Greys," he replied. I nodded. The Corti were small, even smaller than this being, gray-skinned but with large eyes and oversized brains as a result of centuries-long eugenics program within their species, which had vastly expanded their intellect. Most other species suspected that their sense of empathy was atrophied as a side effect, the campaign to make themselves smarter. They were known for abducting specimens of a pre-contact species, experimenting on them to acquire biological data, then using that information to be able to sell cybernetic technology to the newcomers that was appropriate to their biology. The second they were welcomed into the galactic fold. Unethical, but the species as a whole cannot be prosecuted for the actions of a few, and so the sale of the implants went ahead anyway. Kevin Jenkins had clearly been one of their victims. "Apt," I said. "Why not have the implant removed and return to your homeworld?" "Because I'd never be able to keep the secret, and so the Office for the Preservation of Indigenous Species won't let me," he said. "Can we please start with the official stuff? I haven't slept in 2 standard urinals." "I apologize," I said, chagrined over my own lack of professionalism. I activated the corral's recording function. Interview begins. Interstellar Convenience Standard date/time 1196-5-24.4. Civilian Trade Station 591. Outlook on Forever. Customs and Immigration Officer Kritik Konsidik. Interviewing immigrant pre-contact abductee. Could you repeat your identification for me, please? Abductee 907-42-96-53-3. Male. Name Kevin Jenkins. My species refer to ourselves as human. Our homeworld is a Category 12 tempered at Interrupted him. Must ask you to take this interview seriously. Your visa will be denied if you continue to mock the immigration system. Its facial feature twisted up into an expression of amusement. I assure you, officer, I'm not mocking the immigration system. My species' homeworld really is a Category 12 temperate. You'll find documentary verification of that fact on this data storage. I ripped the data from the storage and attached it to the recording. True to his word, a full survey of the human homeworld revealed that it was indeed Category 12, a death world. Hostile, vicious, and forever primordial. Experimentally, I tried to enter this fact onto the paperwork, which of course threw up an error code. It is considered impossible for sentient beings to evolve on Category 12 planets, I said. As I explained off the record, according to Article 227, Paragraph 16 of the Galactic Treaty of Laws, I am legally not a sentient being. It raised his forelimbs and the torso joints moved in a complicated way, denoting resignation. I gave this some consideration and scrapped the form. He was quite correct that Stas made properly navigating him through the immigration paperwork impossible. The recording would just have to do. Jenkins nodded, and our implants eventually decided that he meant that a prediction had come true. You can see why the administration on Station 442 kicked me out, he said. I'm a bureaucratic anomaly. The whole system is far too rigid to accommodate me and mine. I caught myself nodding my agreement and shut the gesture down. It would show up on the record and negatively impact my next performance evaluation. I get the impression that Station 442 is not the only place where I was interrupted by an alarm. 3 short howls of noise. The attack alarm. Excuse me. Impossible, I exclaimed as I leapt out of my chair and registered in the motion the corral shut down our privacy field. The remaining passengers from the shuttle that we had been processing were responding with varying degrees of calmness. Some more skittish species were beating a hasty retreat to the shuttle's airlock, while others waited for instructions. I had not finished gathering my thoughts when there was a sudden violent lurch that knocked me from my feet. I saw Jenkins sway with the motion and remain upright, despite the fact that he was balanced precariously on only 2 legs. A second alarm began to sound, a long wail of a station damage alarm. This was then followed by an angry growl of a hull breach alarm, but oddly not the decompression alarm. That could only mean one thing. Them. Here, I asked of nobody as I struggled to my feet and trotted to the weapons locker. Them? Jenkins asked, lopping along easily next to me in what was clearly much lower gravity than he was evolved for. The locker reacted to the security codes. My station's security officer's harness was broadcasting and open, spilling out a pair of pulse guns, 2 personal shield emitters, and a magazine of coin-sized nerve jam grenades. I slapped a shield emitter to the power dock on my harness. There's no visible change, but the sense tendrils along my back felt a tingling as the shield came online. The pulse gun configured itself for my species as I picked it up and connected its power cable to my harness. Hunters, I whispered. Jenkins didn't seem especially frightened by the news, but then I realized he had almost certainly never heard of the only carnivorous species in the galaxy that preferred the meat of fellow sentients. I didn't have time to explain. There was the sound of pulse gunfire and squealing being galloped into this customs area before being caught from behind by a kinetic pulse that hurled it to the ground, broken and dying. Jenkins sprinted for cover, and I followed. Despite my longer legs, he covered the ground faster and threw himself behind a customs booth as another kinetic pulse missed him. I turned and shot at the hunter that had aimed at us. My shot evaporated harmlessly against the protection field identical to mine. There were 3 more behind it, and I ducked into cover next to the human as their return fire threatened to overwhelm my defenses. We're in trouble, I whined. All around us, fleeing and panicking immigrants were being smashed to the ground by hunter firepower. Jenkins popped his head above the countertop and ducked again as a volley of shots targeted him. 6 of them, he said. Ugly motherfuckers. I had to agree, as I fired a few suppressing shots around the corner. Well, judging any species by the aesthetic values of your own species doesn't make a lot of sense. Hunters were ugly. Their skin was a grotesque matte ceramic white, and their 7 eyes, each blinking independently, provided them with exceptional depth perception. On 6 legs, they were extremely stable, and their forelimbs were cybernetically fused into their heavy pulse guns, making disarming them impossible. These ones were wearing full military combat harness. My own light security harness was no match. Our only hope was the magazine of nerve jam grenades, which I realized with the falling sensation of failure I had left in the locker. The grenades, I swore. Only hope? Jenkins asked. He was holding himself low and hunched. I could see those dense, high-gravity muscles tense and ready under his lightly furred skin. I nodded, fighting back the urge to excrete in my terror. Excuse me. If they took us alive, we would be food. By the time I realized that Jenkins had taken off at a flat sprint towards the locker, he was almost a third of the way there. I knew what I had to do. The hunters were turning to fire at him as I popped up from cover. They saw me coming, but I put 3 rounds into one, and its shield failed against the third. It collapsed, but passed for its face shattered by the impact, and I ducked as its fellows returned fire. One ignored me and kept firing at Jenkins, but he was so fast, so small, and the round smacked into the deck plating around him. He threw his feet out ahead of him and slid the last few strides to the locker. He popped up to his feet, looked at me as he raised his arm, and threw, accurately and much, much farther than I could have thrown them. Then a pulse round took him in the torso and flung him against the wall. I had no time to mourn. I caught the grenade, slipped one from the cylindrical container, counted 2 light pulses from the indicator around its edge, and threw it towards the enemy on the third. A second later, there was a flare of light and shrieking, but it was not enough. 2 of the hunters rampaged past their convulsing comrades, rushing me. I fired, but fear took my aim, and the best I managed was a single round that impacted harmlessly against the shield before the return fire broke my own shielding and ruined my arm. I collapsed, shaking from pain. The hunters trotted round the corner, eerily silent. Nobody had ever heard them communicate verbally. I stared at their twin heavy pulse guns, too afraid to even close my eyes before the end. It didn't come. Instead, something black, blue, and brown hurtled into the flank of one of the alien warriors with a crunch and a hiss of pain. It staggered and collided with its comrade and fell. Jenkins, somehow impossibly alive despite taking a kinetic pulse round to the chest, wrestled very briefly with the hunter, and then there was a horrible organic splitting noise. The hiss became a shriek, and the gun was in hands, blood and mangled meat dripping from the cybernetic interface. The second hunter snap-fired, and Jenkins dropped the gun as the shot winged him. He didn't seem to notice. Instead, he pounced, and a second shot barely missed him before his forepaw lashed out, balled up into a hard knot of gravity-dense bone and flesh, which he drove into the hunter's eye cluster. It shrieked and flailed, swatting the human with its hind limbs. He didn't appear to care. Instead, he caught one of the flailing limbs, braced one of his own feet against the hunter's flank, and heaved with a roar. There was a grim tearing noise, and the hunter's leg came away. Its blood sprayed thick and fat throughout the air, coating the man from the death world, but he ignored it. He didn't spare the fallen alien a second glance as he charged the lone survivor. It was suicide. The hunter had a clear shot and took it. And then a second, then a third, and a fourth, and though every single one was on target, Jenkins just kept going, apparently completely impervious to the impacts that would have pulped any other species. Hunters don't wear interspecies communication implants, but I didn't need one to recognize the fear and panic it briefly had time to show before it was beaten to death with another hunter's severed leg. Jenkins just kept hitting it again and again, snarling and shouting, ordering it to die and declaring improbable things about its parentage before finally he stopped and stepped away from the broken thing he had made, gulping down great shuddering breaths of what to him must have been very thin and dry air. Then he apparently lost the strength to stand, and his forelimbs folded up underneath him. His head sank down until the pointed bottom of his jaw was resting against his torso. I swallowed my pain and staggered to my feet. My arm dangled uselessly by my side, and every slight movement was agony, but I had to know if he was alive. The all-clear alarm sounded just before I reached him, and he moved in response to it. One of his eyes had been swollen and was turning a dark red-purple. The other blinked at me, and his mouth curled upwards at the corners. I saw that one of his teeth was missing. "Tough bastards," he said, and spat bright red blood onto the hunter's corpse next to him. I couldn't help it. I had to laugh.